Is this a female?
A human, female, Latek?
It's true. You work with your females, arm them, and force them to wear clothing. Sickening.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, when we think about Jewish representation in Star Trek, the first thing that likely comes to mind is the Vulcan salute, a hand-gestured Leonard Nimoy famously based on the Jewish priestly blessing. Or maybe we think of the Vulcans as a species, or perhaps the Bajorans, who endured a harsh occupation by the Cardassians, arguably coded Nazis, or Worf's adoptive father, played by quintessential Jew Theodor Bickel, or Jewish actors like Leonard Nimoy, William Shatner, Walter Koenig, and Brent Spiner. But like it or not, the most Jewish thing about Star Trek is the Ferengi.
We're excited to talk again with Miriam Eve Mora, the managing director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute at the University of Michigan and author of Carrying a Big Schtick, Jewish Acculturation and Masculinity in the 20th Century. Her chapter, The Jewish Case for Fereginar, is published in the book Jews in Popular Science Fiction, Marginalized in the Mainstream, edited by friend of the show, Valerie Estelle Frankel. Miriam, welcome back to Amusing Jews.
Thank you so much for having me back. It is a delight.
You note in your chapter, The Jewish Case for Fereginar, that the Ferengi, as they originally appeared on Star Trek The Next Generation, were based on Shakespeare's problematic character Shylock from The Merchant of Venice. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I was surprised by that revelation too. I found some original sketches by Andrew Probert, who was an early designer on Next Generation, and he did a number of concept sketches of the Ferengi based on conversations with the showrunners and creators about what kind of a villain they were supposed to be, because they're supposed to be the new big bad, right, of the Next Generation. So they're supposed to step in and kind of replace the Klingons. And from some recollections that the creative team had, it sounds like the first idea that was really discussed about the design was based on Scrooge McDuck. This image of someone kind of diving through their sea of gold coins and splashing around in their riches, you know. And the idea was that the Klingons had been larger than life, and the Romulans were kind of medium, and these were supposed to be the small villains. But in some of those original concept sketches, the other thing that they've referenced, that Scrooge McDuck thing apparently dropped off pretty quickly, and what they referenced was Shylock. So the idea is that they have beards, and they're kind of based on this more Roman or Assyrian looking, money lending archetype, right? So even some of those original concepts of what this species should look like, based entirely on the fact that they were supposed to be representative of some of humanity's worst features, being capitalism and greed, the archetype they went to was Shylock. And that is, arguably, and I think there's a long literary history of this, of just how anti-Semitic that character and its depictions are. So it's an interesting reference point, even though they did end up doing away with those long pointy beards.
But they still retain sort of a stereotypical physiognomy and appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing, actually, how many similarities they have, although they're obviously dramatized so much from being human features to try and make them alien features. So, what you could take a kind of anti-Semitic archetype about Jews and break it down into these phenotypical features, and then kind of blow those up into an alien feature, and then you get the Ferengi. So the idea that Jews have oddly shaped or oversized noses or ears, small beady eyes, even some much more obscure anti-Semitic archetypes, like having odd fingernails, The Ferengi have blue fingernails in each iteration of the show, or each Star Trek show that features the Ferengi. That they wear headdresses. They have these traditional headdresses that the Ferengi wear. The large cranium to store their massive brains, are also references. But even some of the things that are not phenotypical in how they appear in the early episodes, um, references to some people believing that they were cannibals, right? And you think of blood libel accusations. I mean, the parallels are you want to deny it, and it's really hard to deny.
Yeah, and they have a big aftermarket, I guess. After they die, they sell off pieces of their bodies and stuff like that. Pound of flesh, Shylock.
Yeah, absolutely. A connection I hadn't even made, right? I have always struggled with this, like, are the Ferengi space Jews? And so the way I structured my argument in this chapter is like, yes, they're space Jews, because we can't deny that they're not space Jews. But no, they're not space Jews because they're not Jewish, right? Like, there are all these, they're Jewish. Yes, they're space Jews in that they adhere to anti-Semitic stereotypes, but no, they're not space Jews in that they're nothing like Jews, right? But then they become actual space Jews through Deep Space Nine. That's the argument that I make.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Before reading your chapter, I was blissfully ignorant about accusations that Gene Roddenberry was himself an anti-Semite. How does that square with his positive reputation as a humanist who envisioned a harmonious future for all of humanity?
The simplest answer is likely the truth, right, in most things, which is, in this case, I would posit that Roddenberry was a human, right? Complex, flawed, a product of his own time and place. But he was absolutely, regardless of, any accusations of anti-Semitism or anything else, and there are lots of kind of behind the scenes rumors of his behavior on lots of different points, but he was absolutely a hero for forward thinking people in so many ways, right? I mean, the first interracial kiss on TV, absolutely, but also the thing I always point to is having a Japanese man at the helm, right after World War II, a direct kind of contradiction to the popular, image of kamikaze fighter pilots, right? That we would trust our starship to this Japanese pilot is huge. Not to mention the fact that we're in the midst of the Cold War, and Chekhov is the boy genius at the helm of the ship as well, right? So we have these two characters who are obvious enemies of the United States in our present, and that is like such a forward-thinking future. There's no denying it. And to hear George Takei talk about what that role meant to him, and how Japanese men were portrayed in television at the time and how Japanese American actors experienced Hollywood at the time, there is no doubt, I think, that Gene Roddenberry had an incredible vision for a harmonious future. That said, um, Leonard Nimoy recalled Roddenberry later in his life as being anti-Semitic. But what he said was, and this is some of what I drew for, in my analysis, he said that Roddenberry was anti-Semitic, but that what he really was anti-religion, which does jive somewhat, I'd say, with the future we see on the original Star Trek series, which is that all people, nationalities, ethnicities, alien races are accepted, right? And that there is this harmonious future, but you'll notice a distinct absence of religion in the Star Trek series for the most part, again, until Deep Space Nine, right? And when they do, just like bigots, when they do appear, they're mocked, right? I mean, Star Trek does tend to um to 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 tear into bigotry, I think, right? I mean, that's what Roddenberry did. Is he said, look at these racists; they are ludicrous, right? Like, I think of Let This Be Our Last Battlefield. You guys remember that original series episode with the aliens that were black on one side and white on the other at war with the ones that were white on black side, right? Like, that's just reversed, like, so ludicrous. And so I think he does the same thing sometimes with religion, and I think about that episode, The Way to Eden, with the space hippies. Yeah, and he's like clearly mocking them, right? because they're in this spiritual, and he's like, whatever, that's all ridiculous. The way I've kind of come to think about him now is kind of like, and this is going to seem overly harsh because I do appreciate Gene Roddenberry and his legacy, but I think of him kind of like Richard Nixon, in that Richard Nixon was anti-Semitic, right? He had this like kind of classic anti-Semitic assumptions about Jews or beliefs about the Jewish people and the Jewish character, but he worked with Jews to create great things. And he left I mean, I know Watergate is what people think of, but he also created the EPA and he created like the Clean Water Act. I mean, Nixon left some great legacies and he did so in partnership with a lot of really creative and intelligent Jewish colleagues. And I think Roddenberry did the same. He wasn't anti-Semitic enough to not hire Shatner or Nimoy or, any of the many, many, many other Jews he worked closely with. I don't know how he treated them, behind the scenes, but like Ira Bear, Steve Berman, these showrunners, also a lot of Jews involved in the writing and creation process.
You note that the Ferengi's 285 rules of acquisition have little to do with the 613 commandments extracted from the Torah. While the Jewish commandments are intended to elevate the practitioner's spiritual character, the rules of acquisition are ultra-materialistic and capitalistic. Is it a stretch to see the rules of acquisition as an anti-Semite's version of the Jewish commandments?
I think it is easiest to see the rules of acquisition as a parody written by someone with like all of the knowledge, the inside baseball to make a really ludicrous parody, right, of Jewish culture in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, that is a really tiny minority of potential Star Trek viewers. The rules of acquisition, I don't know. I can't, there's no statement as to whether or not they were created as this parallel, but I think it's hard um, not to see a connection. And I think that if you view it as a kind of, not even an inside joke, but satire, right? Satire on this kind of pre-existing, um, having kind of fallen into this archetype of Ferengi as space Jews, then embracing these pieces of Jewish culture by turning them on their head is actually a really kind of Jewish humor way of coping, I think, with this unfortunate connection, regardless of how it began, which is a lot of my argument for how I think the Ferengi got turned around and made into a good species. But I think that a lot of people see the similarity and miss the joke, right? For those people who might have written it as a joke, because these laws, the rules of acquisition, are so un-Jewish, right? They so directly contradict so much of Jewish law, Jewish life. Like the Ten Commandments are flipped on their head in some of them. The you're not like no stealing is obviously completely reversed. And I think of another satire that I always come back to from 1928 by Marcus Eli Ravage, who wrote a piece in Century Magazine called A Real Case Against the Jews. It was a satire piece about Jewish conspiracy theories, right, which were blowing up at the time, 1928. It's after the first publications of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and then being translated into English, and he's writing this in America. And what he writes in this piece, which is satirical, is that the real crime of the Jews was accidentally imposing Christianity on Aryans who used to be blissfully happy pagans, right? But it is, even now, if you search for it on Google Books, people republish it saying this is an actual confession of a Jew who has committed these crimes. So I think that a lot of this satire, which is written humorously, but with all the knowledge of insider baseball, it misses the mark with the wrong audiences, and Jews are the minority.
You credit Ira Stephen Bear, the Jewish showrunner of DS9, with rehabilitating the disreputable Ferengi. What do you think was his motivation?
I don't know what his motivation was. He hasn't given any direct commentary on the Jewish connection. I think I see two distinct possibilities. One is that what he has said was that he was not excited to write the Ferengi. When he started running Deep Space Nine, he didn't want to involve a Ferengi character. and he didn't want to write for the Ferengi. That he has said. He hasn't talked about his particular investment in the species after that, but I read it. I think it is, as I say, I see two distinct possibilities. One, I think it's very likely that he said, okay, how do I make this species better? And unconsciously, perhaps, drew from his well of Jewish knowledge to make them better in a very Jewish way. I think it's also possible that it was much more intentional, that the reason that he didn't want to write the Ferengi is he knew they were seen as space Jews. Maybe he also saw them as space Jews and wanted to, and said, if I have to write them, I'm going to fix them. The real question to me is, um, did he know that, did he intentionally fix them in the most Jewish way imaginable? Or was that just, how do I make people better? I'll draw from history. And he just happens to know Jewish history as a Jewish American. Because I think that the ways in which he changed the Ferengi species were not just Jewish and not just historical, but absolutely brilliant. He didn't, um, there's no retconning involved here. That's what's so beautiful about the development of this species, is he said, how do we make them grow? And he used Jewish history to rewrite their narrative. So I don't know what your motivation, how conscious he was of it. I don't know.
And they still have that douchebag cousin who shows up once in a while just to kind of compare, a previous incarnation of the Ferengi and how far the Deep Space Nine characters have come.
So Liquidator Brunt keeps coming back as the foil, right? But I think it's especially interesting. You say like the cousin that comes back and shows us, what they were. And I argue that Quark is also kind of that character. I kind of label him as the true believer. He's the one that teaches us everything about the Ferengi and that shows us, the determination to like hold true to these beliefs. But Brunt is the negative side of that coin, right? Liquidator Brunt is constantly coming back and just being the worst Ferengi. I love that character because I love Jeffrey Combs and every iteration of Jeffrey Combs and I think he was in 6 different roles in Deep Space Nine, all different species or something. He's just amazing.
Well, I'm also thinking like Zek, right? He was the one played by Wallace Shawn, and he also starts off pretty gnarly. Definitely anti-Semitic,
Well, the great thing about the evolution of this series, one of the many great things about the evolution of this species on the series is that they all start out terrible. I mean, every one of these characters you meet, and you're like, ugh, another Ferengi, right? I mean, like Quark is deplorably everything Ferengi, and not only that, Armin Shimmerman played one of the first Ferengi in The Last Outpost, right? The very first episode where we see the very first Ferengi, he's one of the 3 or 4 that we see. And he talked about how much he regretted that performance, right? And how dedicated he was to kind of changing that image. But so we see that not only is he this character that we're supposed to not really like when he's introduced in the first episode of Deep Space Nine, but because he's the same actor, he really pulls us back to that first introduction to the worst Ferengi. And then, Rom, his brother, is this total schlemazel and a complete idiot, right? And his son is this like Nog is this kind of awful, terrible kid that you just don't want to be around, and he's compared with Cisco's son, who's like so delightful and perfect, and he's corrupting him. And then we have the Grand Nagus, who's Zek Wallace Shawn, so amazing. But yeah, he comes in and he's even more grotesque than all the other Ferengi because he's so old, and so all of his features are even more exaggerated and he's so unpleasant. Plus, he's got that Wallace Shawn whine, which is so just perfectly Jewish.
Gotcha!
Every character comes in as a negative, and then they're each kind of, redeemed through the process of their, not just their character development, but the way they then change the species and the society, right? Nog becomes the first Starfleet Ferengi. Rom becomes a union leader. Ishka becomes a feminist agitator. Zek becomes the disruptive reformer. It is an amazing amount of progress for one species in a show. totally turned on its head. And it's done so through this meticulous character development. And I argue every one of those characters that is turned on its head is in itself a piece of Jewish history, right? Pieces that are traceable and clear, especially Rom.
You describe how the 5 main Ferengi on DS9, Ishka, Zek, Rom, Nob, and Quark, helped turn the Ferengi into space mensches. Could you give us a summary?
I'll begin with Ishka. Ishka is the only female character that we get to know from Ferenginar. We only see 2 female Ferengi ever. One is a Ferengi who gets hired in Quark's bar and is posing as a man, which is like the whole episode is Yentl. And the other is Ishka, which, as I mentioned, all the parallels, of course, between, Jews and Ferengi, very close to the word for woman, right? Isha. But Ishka is this fantastic character originally played by Andrea Martin, who is not Jewish, but replaced by Cecily Adams, who is a Jewish actress. And Ishka is this kind of rebel of Ferengi society. So Ferengi women are not involved in commerce. Ferengi women are doting mothers who take care of their children. They pre-chew their food. They file their teeth to points, and they never wear clothing. It is shameful to see a Ferengi woman in clothing.
Your mother is wearing clothes. Mother, get undressed this instant.
Hello, Quark. You haven't changed a bit.
And Ishka, who serves the role, kind of entering as a Jewish stereotype and exiting as a piece of redemptive Jewish history. She enters as this doting Jewish mother, kind of overbearing, smothering, all of the things you think of in a Philip Roth novel, right? And her 2 sons represent those kind of the two literary reactions to the Jewish mother, right? Rom is the, nice Jewish boy, kind of obsessed with mom. And, he comes home and she dotes on him and she pre-chews his food for him and all these things. And he turns against her, and he just wants her to obey societal rules and be done with it. And in the end, she ends up not only being this kind of hardcore feminist visionary, right? Having her own version, her dreams for Ferengi women parallel things said by, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Betty Friedan, all these feminist luminaries. But she also ends up partnered with the Grand Nagus and helping him, and therefore all of Ferengi society to adapt reforms not because she bullies him and not because she controls him, but because he falls in love with her and he respects her as a Ferengi. So she helps to reform all of Ferengi society through this kind of radical feminism, which is an incredibly Jewish story in America. So I'll move to Zek because he's, partnered with Ishka. When he comes into the series, he's more grotesque than almost any other Ferengi because he is old, because he's like hard to look at, the makeup, the prosthetics, it is just terrible. And he's the embodiment of Ferengi society. So he comes in with the rules of acquisition and holding his gold pressed latinum staff. And I mean, he's just all the things we are taught to hate about Ferengi. And then by the end, he changes Ferengi society. So he becomes the reform to society. Rom, who enters as the ultimate schlemazel, the way my mother always taught me the schlemiel and schlemazel were defined was she gave 2 examples. She said the schlemiel always spills his soup and it always lands in the lap of the schlemazel. And the other was that if he walks by a ladder, the schlemiel knocks it over and it knocks out the schlemazel, right? So Rom is the schlemazel. He doesn't do anything bad. He's just always the victim. He's the victim of his brother Quark's bullying. He's the victim of Ferengi and larger Federation society. And he's just kind of a bumbling fool until he leads the unionization project of Quark's bar. And he quotes Karl Marx and he looks to human history, right? He talks to Chief O'Brien and he talks about unionist movements and socialism, and he quotes Marx' Communist Manifesto, and he says,
"Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains.
This incredible moment, and it is so antithetical to Ferengi society. And he wins, right? He wins this unionization project, and he may not change Quark, but he does change their existence, right? And then, of course, he becomes the next Grand Nagus. So not only does he embrace kind of the best qualities of humanity, but he does so in a Ferengi way that redefines Ferengi history. And that is a Jewish story too. I mean, there's almost no American stories that are more Jewish than the stories of feminism and unionization, right? Especially like in the textile industry in New York. That is a Jewish immigrant story. Nog was particularly fun for me to think of as a changing character because he comes in as this kind of despicable child with all these terrible qualities, and then he decides to enter the Federation, which flies in the face of everything that his father and his uncle have raised him with. But he wants to embrace this society that has embraced him on Deep Space Nine, and he goes to war. And the Ferengi have been painted as cowards since the very first appearance in the last outpost in the Next Generation, right? I mean, yes, they have those ludicrous laser whips, and they're whipping them around. But they're also like cowering. And when they attack Worf, they like scramble on him like monkeys and they're biting on him. And I mean, the whole thing's just so preposterous, right? And Nog defies that by bravely not only joining the Federation, but doing so in a time of war. And he goes to fight the Dominion. And he's wounded. And I think in a show of like, we talk about masculinity and ideas in our contemporary moment of toxic masculinity. He enters the military, he gets wounded, and he has to really grapple with his own trauma in a way that I think, and come to terms with it in a way that is embracing the best parts of masculinity, right? And saying, like, I did suffer and I am damaged and I will move, and it's not that the leg is gone because he lost a leg. But of course, we're in the future now, right? They just gave him a new leg. But that doesn't erase the trauma, and he embraces it and he works through it.
Are you okay?
No. But I will be.
And he's this war hero. And I think that flies in the face of all of the negative stereotypes of cowardice, evasion of duty, all of those things that have plagued Jewish men in American history and in European history, and plagued the Ferengi. The last character that I really talk about as one of these archetypes is Quark, who I paint as kind of the true believer, the orthodox, and he is our guide through Ferengi culture. So he's absolutely despicable too when we meet him. And he's the one who's always, as every one of these things is happening, his mother is reforming, Zek is changing society, Rom is unionizing, and then Rom marries a Bajoran Dabo girl, right? And Nog joins Starfleet, and the whole time Quark is just clinging to his truth, right? But he's doing so, I argue, in a really Jewish way too, in that he's saying, like, I can bend, I just can't break, right? So there are lines he won't cross, but he can see a future, and he can adapt his interpretation of the rules of acquisition to meet that bright future. He just can't break them. So I see him as this true believer type. But the negative side of that is what I coin like the Jewish lawyer archetype, right? He's the Shylock, the constant, money seeking, deal making, that's his introduction. But he comes out of it as, I would argue, the most positive character in the show.
Do you think it's a coincidence that all these characters were portrayed by Jewish actors, or is there something more to that?
A coincidence? It's an awfully big coincidence. I think there's something very real about the start of this series, the start of the species, which was whether by fault, whether by accident or by intent, the Ferengi fell in a pit of anti-Semitic stereotype, right? They became space Jews. It was bad. It was bad, right? At the beginning, there's no denying that it was bad. But once you're in that pit, once you say like, okay, this character, the Klingons are defined by warmongering. We need a new corruptive influence. Okay, this species is going to be designed to be defined by capitalism. How do we paint that visibly? And you draw on what you know, and what people know is anti-Semitic stereotypes. It's not because people are inherently anti-Semitic or because they believe these things to be true. It is because in our society, in modern society, anti-Semitism, and especially the way anti-Semitism depicts Jews visibly, it is in the very air that we breathe. We all see it, and we all internalize it. Even those of us who absolutely know it's not true, right? That Jews don't look like Ferengi. But when people, whether Jewish or not, and a lot of these designers and creators were Jewish, but when you say like, okay, what does someone look like if they're a species defined by capitalism? They fell into this pit, right? And they said, okay, they're going to be small and they're going to be conniving and they're going to have beady eyes and and these big grotesque features and poof, space Jews, right? I honestly don't think it was fully intentional. But I think once they fell into that pit, there was no way out. And part of it was the stature, and part of it was the noses, and part of it was the squeaky, irritating voices. How could you not cast Wallace Shawn and Andrea Martin? Right? And Andrea Martin's not Jewish, but she defined that character. And a lot of her characters that she played on SCTV and they're squeaky little women. Powerful, loud, domineering, squeaky little women. And that's part of the archetype. So was it an accident? Was it a coincidence? No. They created a type that became the species that happened to be Jews. That's giving them all the benefit of the doubt, which I like to give my Star Trek creators. But yeah, I think the characters that weren't played by Jews in the Ferengi were played by let's go to Jeffrey Combs, who played Liquidator Brunt, and Jeffrey Combs is just their go-to actor for every species. He's absolutely wonderful. But I don't think they would have cast him had he just come in on a casting call because he didn't fit the type. The type was already there.
As you point out, Nog has something of a Ferengi bar mitzvah.
Yesterday, I completed the Ferengi attainment ceremony. I'm an adult.
Do you think that was an intentionally coded reference to the Jewish ceremony?
How could I not? He's so proud. I think it was. I think it is by that point. I'm gonna just believe that by that point the showrunners acknowledged that there were elements of this that were just Jewish. He walked in the room and he said, I just completed my Ferengi attainment ceremony. I'm an adult, right? And he comes in with this bag of latinum. I think it was one of the most undeniably Jewish gifts they gave us. And what is a Ferengi attainment ceremony? If it is a passage, and he says it's a rite of passage into adulthood. No one, absolutely no one who grew up in America, who never even met a Jew, if you ask them what is an attainment ceremony that is a rite of passage into adulthood, they'd say a bar mitzvah.
We can assume that means that he is now obligated to follow the rules of acquisition.
Exactly. That's exactly. It is so perfectly Jewish.
I imagine studying and reciting rules of acquisition might have been a part of that ceremony.
The rules of acquisition are so delightful, by the way, for any listeners who have not actually read the book, which was co-written, I believe, by Ira Behr and Armin Shimmerman, and the audiobook is read by Armin Shimmerman. Absolutely worth it.
What might we learn from the transformation of Ferengi from stereotypical scheming merchants into more positive Jewish representations?
I think it teaches us two very important lessons. One is that it is okay to correct a mistake in canon. Whether that's a mistake or a misstep or even, a criminally offensive act in canon. I would say it is okay to correct a mistake in canon through progress instead of retconning. I think it's something we don't see enough. I don't know that I can actually point to any other example of this in a canon as kind of foundational as Star Trek, because it goes beyond the idea of fixing an error. The way they redeemed the Ferengi, it speaks to the concept of progress, right? Which is so at the heart of the dream of the Federation, that we can get better. And it's like the showrunners, the writers, they acknowledge the Ferengi can get better, and they do it by acknowledging that we as writers, we can create better content. We can fix it by making progress. And I think that is unprecedented and beautiful. The other thing that I think that we can learn from this transformation is that knowing and embracing history makes us better storytellers. Because I can't imagine any other way that this redemption could have been done. They took the negative, connected it to the history it was offending, and used history to redeem. And I think the whole process is fantastic. And more people should strive towards that. Not necessarily just you just learning the history, but weaving it into a new and creative narrative.
Well, thank you, Miriam, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I would love to come back and talk more nerdy stuff with you guys anytime.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.